16 years old, and she owned nothing in this world but a carpetbag, a dead mother's Bible, and $11.40 sewn into the hem of her only good dress. Her uncle, Thaddeus Boyle, who had taken the family farm the week her parents were buried, told her plainly that a girl her age was a mouth he would not keep feeding, and put her on the road with a wagon ride to town, and nothing more. With what little she had, she did something the whole of Larkspur Hollow would call foolish. She walked into Deacon's livery yard, where broken-down rigs went to rot, and paid $4 silver for an old, abandoned stagecoach nobody had touched in 20 years. The coach folks still crossed themselves over, the one that had vanished into a blizzard with its driver, and never came back the same. She did not know, as she climbed up into that rotted seat and ran her hand along its cracked leather, that sealed beneath the driver's bench, was something that would not only change the whole shape of her life, but hand back to an entire town what it had spent 2 decades believing was lost forever, stolen, gone to dust with a dead man's sins. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Mercy Callahan. If you have ever been told that you were worth less than what people threw away, we hope you'll stay with us tonight. And if you're watching from a place that feels forgotten, tell us in the comments. Mercy Callahan had been born in the spring of 1870 in a clapboard house at the edge of Larkspur Hollow, Wyoming Territory, to a mother who mended dresses for half the women in town and a father who broke horses for the other half. They were not wealthy people, the Callahans, but they were known, in the particular way that small towns know their own, known for the father's steady hands with a frightened animal, known for the mother's needle that could make a torn hem disappear like it had never existed, known, most of all, for a kind of quiet decency that asked for nothing and gave what it could. It was from her mother that Mercy learned to see worth where other people saw ruin. She remembered being no older than 6, sitting at her mother's knee, while Sarah Callahan turned a moth-eaten coat collar inside out and re-sewed it so cleverly that Widow Hodge wore it to church for 3 more winters, never knowing the collar had been condemned to the rag bin before Sarah got her hands on it. Nothing is finished being useful, her mother used to say, biting off a thread with her teeth, until somebody decides it is. It was a small thing to say, the kind of thing mothers say while their hands are busy, but it planted itself in Mercy, the way a seed plants itself in good soil, waiting for the season when it would matter most. From her father she learned patience, the particular, bone-deep patience required to gentle something wild and frightened, without breaking its spirit. She used to watch him with the mustangs the ranchers brought him, watch how he would stand at the far side of a corral for an hour without moving, just letting the animal get used to the shape of him, the smell of him, before he ever raised a hand. "You don't win trust by grabbing for it," he told her once, when she was 8 and impatient with a barn cat that wouldn't come to her. "You win it by being the kind of thing worth trusting, and then waiting." She did not know, as a girl, how many times she would need to remember that lesson, how many closed, frightened, wary things she would have to approach slowly in the years to come, some of them animals, and some of them people, and one of them, eventually, an entire grieving town. The Callahans were not rich, but they were whole, and for the first 14 years of Mercy's life, that felt like enough. She grew up barefoot in summer, and bundled in flour sack coats in winter, grew up reading by lamplight from the 3 books her family owned, grew up under the wide Wyoming sky, learning the names of the mountains that ringed the valley, the way other children learned nursery rhymes. She had a best friend, a boy named Eli Marsh, whose family ran the feed store, and together, they used to climb up to the ridge above town and look down at Larkspur Hollow's tin roofs and dream, the way children do, about all the places they would go and all the things they would become. She did not dream, back then, about stagecoaches or strongboxes or secrets sealed in old wood. She dreamed about small things, a dress that fit her right, a horse of her own, a life that looked something like her parents' life, steady and known and loved. The town itself carried its own old wound, one that predated Mercy's birth by only a few years, but that had settled into Larkspur Hollow's bones like a splinter that never worked its way out. In 1866, the Comstock silver mine 2 miles up the canyon had collapsed in a spring flood, taking 11 men down with it, and the town had done what small, hard, decent towns do. It had taken up a collection for the widows and orphans left behind. A relief fund gathered dollar by dollar from ranchers and shopkeepers and the mine company itself, until it totaled some $4,000, an enormous sum for that place and time. The fund had been entrusted to the stagecoach line for transport to the Territorial Bank in Cheyenne, where it would be held safe and dispersed to the families. And on a night in November of that same year, during a blizzard that dropped snow for 11 straight hours, the stagecoach carrying that fund had gone out on its run and never arrived. The driver, a solitary, well-liked man named Amos Whitlock, was found frozen 3 days later in a gully 2 miles off the road, and the coach itself was discovered abandoned and half buried near a ravine, its strongbox missing, its cargo gone. The town's grief over the mine disaster curdled, in the months that followed, into something uglier: suspicion, and then near certainty, that Amos Whitlock had stolen the widow's money and hidden it before the cold took him, that he had died with the town's mercy and Larkspur Hollow's rescue, clutched somewhere just out of reach, spitefully lost to history. His name became a byword in the town for 20 years. Whitlock, they'd say, the way you'd say a curse word, and his widow and young son had left within the year, unable to bear the weight of a name nobody would speak kindly again. This was the ghost that lived quietly under Larkspur Hollow's floorboards on the day Mercy Callahan, orphaned and alone, wandered into Deacon's livery yard 14 years after that story had gone cold. The fall came fast, the way it does for so many, dressed up as a single ordinary week that quietly ended everything. In the autumn of Mercy's 15th year, a fever came through the hollow, the same low, mean sickness that took 3 other families that season. And it took her mother first, in the space of 4 days, and her father, 11 days after that, worn down by grief and exhaustion, and his own weakened lungs, until his heart simply stopped one cold morning before he'd risen from bed. Mercy buried them both in the little cemetery on the rise above town, next to each other under the cottonwoods, and she was 15 years and 11 months old, with no brothers, no sisters, and no one left in the world but her father's younger brother, Thaddeus Boyle, who arrived from 2 counties over, within the week, ostensibly to help, and left 8 months later as the legal owner of the Callahan farm, the horses, the tools, and every last thing her parents had built. Thaddeus was not a cruel man, in the way that stories sometimes need their villains to be cruel. He did not raise his hand to her, did not starve her outright, but he was a small man in the ways that matter, a man who measured every mouthful of food against its cost, and found Mercy, upon reflection, not worth the arithmetic. He had come, she understood only later, because Wyoming law in those years allowed a deceased man's estate to pass to his nearest adult male relative if there was no will naming otherwise, and her father, healthy and 38, had never troubled himself to write one. Thaddeus sold off 2 of the horses within a month. He let the hired hand go and worked Mercy instead, rising before dawn to milk and muck and mend fences, and when she turned 16 that spring, he sat her down at the kitchen table that had been her mother's and told her, without any particular unkindness, only a flat and settled certainty, that the farm could not support 2 adults, that he intended to marry a widow from the next county over, who came with land of her own, and that Mercy would need to make her own way. He gave her a wagon ride into town, her carpet bag, her mother's Bible, and $11.40 that represented every cent Mercy had managed to earn and hide over the preceding months, sewing and mending for neighbors in whatever spare hours she could steal. Her mother's needle, passed down along with her mother's stubborn belief that a woman ought always to have something set aside that nobody else knew about. She stood on the main street of Larkspur Hollow that first evening, as a girl with no home, watching the wagon that had carried her away from the only life she'd known rattle back out of town, and she felt, for the first time in her 16 years, entirely and utterly alone. She spent that night in the loft above the livery stable, which old Silas Deakins allowed for a dime, and it was there, unable to sleep, listening to the horses shift and blow in their stalls below her, that she made a decision that would have looked to any sensible observer like the decision of a girl too grief-stricken to think clearly. In the corner of the livery yard, half swallowed by weeds and rust, sat an old stagecoach that had sat unmoved for as long as anyone in town could remember. A relic nobody wanted, that Deacons kept meaning to break apart for lumber and never quite got around to. She had heard, as every child in Larkspur Hollow had heard, the whispered old story of the Whitlock coach, the cursed coach, the one that had swallowed the widow's fortune and a man's good name along with it, though she had never troubled herself to learn the particulars. What she knew, looking at it that night by lantern light, was simpler than any legend. It was a solid piece of a thing, built of good oak by a craftsman who'd known his trade, and it was being left to rot, for want of anyone willing to see it, as anything but cursed. Nothing is finished being useful until somebody decides it is. She heard her mother's voice, as clearly as if Sarah Callahan stood beside her in that dusty loft, and in the morning she found Deacons and asked him, plainly, what he would take for it. He laughed at first, not unkindly, and told her nobody in their right mind would want that thing, that it had bad luck baked into every board of it, that he'd sell it to her, for whatever she wanted to pay, just to see the last of it. She gave him $4, more than fair, and more, she suspected, than he expected to get, and the two of them shook on it, and just like that, Mercy Callahan, orphaned, penniless, and 16 years old, became the owner of the most reviled object in Larkspur Hollow, with $7.40 left to her name, and no earthly idea what she meant to do with a broken-down stagecoach that no one, in 20 years, had been able to look at without crossing themselves. She set to work on it the very next morning, because idleness, she had learned from her father, was its own kind of quicksand, and because she needed, desperately, to have something to do with her hands that wasn't grief. She swept out 2 decades of dust and mouse nests, and dead leaves from the coach's interior, scrubbed the leather seats with saddle soap she paid for in mending work, and began, board by board, to assess what could be saved and what could not. It was slow, patient work, the kind her father would have recognized, the kind that required her to get close to something broken and wait for it to tell her its secrets, rather than forcing them out of it. It was on the 4th day, running her hands along the underside of the driver's bench to check for rot, that her fingers caught on something that should not have been there. A seam in the wood too straight, too deliberate, to be the work of age or damage. She fetched a lantern and got down on her back in the dirt beneath the coach to look up at it properly, and what she found, once her eyes adjusted, was a panel, perhaps 10 inches square, fitted so cleverly into the frame of the bench that a man would have to be looking for it, specifically, to ever notice it existed at all. It took her the better part of an hour, working with a thin file borrowed from Deacons, and more patience than she knew she had, to work the panel free, and when it finally came loose and fell into her waiting palm, she found herself staring not into an empty cavity, but into a small, tightly packed compartment that someone, a very long time ago, had built into that coach on purpose and had never come back to open. What she found first, reaching into the dark with trembling fingers, was a bundle of oilcloth, tied with cord gone brittle with age, and beneath that, wedged in tight, a small tin box, no larger than a hat box, its lid rusted nearly shut. She did not open either that night. She sat instead in the livery loft with the bundle and the box in her lap, her heart going so hard she could feel it in her throat, and understood, with the particular clarity that comes only in moments that will later divide a life into before and after, that whatever she was holding, it was not nothing, and it had been hidden, not lost, hidden by someone who had meant to come back for it, and never had the chance. It took her 3 more days to work up the courage to open the tin box properly, prying at its rusted seam with a knife, until it finally gave, with a groan of protesting metal. Inside, wrapped in what had once been fine linen, and was now yellowed and stiff, she found silver, not a fortune's worth loose and glittering the way a storybook might promise, but coin after coin, carefully stacked and counted, alongside a leather-bound ledger whose pages had gone brittle, but were still, remarkably, legible, filled with careful, cramped handwriting, recording names and sums. Widow Pruitt, $12. The Ostrander family, $8. Collected from the Larkspur Mining Company, $140. Page after page of it. Names Mercy, half recognized from the town's old families. Sums that added up, by her rough count that first sleepless night, to something well over $3,000. A sum so far beyond anything she had ever imagined touching in her life that she had to set the ledger down twice and simply breathe. And tucked into the very back of the ledger, folded into quarters and sealed with wax that had long since cracked, was a letter, addressed to no one in particular, written in a hand that grew visibly more strained across its length, as though the man writing it had been fighting against both cold and time. She read it by lantern light, with her back against the livery wall, and what it told her rewrote everything Larkspur Hollow believed it knew. The letter was signed Amos Whitlock, and it explained, in a voice that came through the page steady and clear, despite its circumstances, that he had been running the relief fund toward Cheyenne, on the night of the blizzard, when he'd spotted riders on the ridge above the pass. Men he recognized, he wrote, as belonging to the Pruitt gang, a band of road agents who had been terrorizing coach lines throughout the territory that whole year, and who he had no doubt meant to relieve him of his cargo before he ever reached the bank. Rather than risk the widow's money to armed men on a lonely road, he had pulled the coach into a stand of trees during the worst of the storm, worked the strongbox's contents loose from its lock with tools kept beneath his seat, and built, in the freezing dark, the hidden compartment that would keep it safe, safe from the riders, safe from the blizzard, safe until he could return with help. He had then continued on, he wrote, hoping to lead the riders away from the coach and toward the town, planning to send men back for both the coach and its rightful cargo once he'd reached safety. He never made it. The cold took him somewhere on that ridge, alone, doing exactly what a decent man does when there is no one watching and a great deal at stake. And the coach, driverless, had been found abandoned days later, its strongbox forced and empty by whoever had gotten to it in the interim, or perhaps never even properly searched by men too spooked by superstition and grief to look closely at a dead man's rig. Amos Whitlock had died not as a thief, but as precisely the opposite, a man who had given his life protecting money that was never his, and had been rewarded for it with 20 years of a ruined name. Mercy sat with that letter until dawn broke gray over the livery roof, and she understood, in the marrow of her, that she was holding something far larger than money. She was holding a dead man's name, and a town's whole understanding of its own history, and, though it would take her some days yet to see the full shape of it, a chance to set right something that had been wrong for 20 years, the way her mother might have turned a condemned coat collar into something worth wearing again. She did not act rashly, because rashness was not in her nature, and because she understood, with a 16-year-old's suddenly sharpened instinct for danger, that a discovery this size could as easily crush her as save her if she moved carelessly. She began, instead, by asking careful questions around town, not about money, never about money, but about the old story, the Whitlock coach, what people remembered, who might know where the driver's widow and son had gone. It was in doing this that she first crossed paths with Silas Pruitt, the town's banker, a smooth, courteous man in his 40s, who owned the largest brick building on Larkspur Hollow's Main Street, and held the mortgage on no fewer than 6 of the town's remaining ranches. Mercy did not know it yet, but Silas Pruitt was the grandson of the very man whose gang had chased Amos Whitlock into that blizzard, and it was Silas's own grandfather who had first, loudly and publicly, floated the theory that the coach driver had stolen the relief fund himself, a theory that had conveniently deflected all suspicion from the Pruitt name at the time the gang's activities were still an open question, and that had, in the 20 years since, allowed the Pruitt family to quietly and respectably rebuild its fortune, buying up grieving, cash-poor widows' land at prices that were never quite fair, always under the cover of Christian charity, toward families the town had written off. When Silas Pruitt heard, through the small-town grapevine that missed nothing, that the orphan girl who'd bought the old cursed coach had been asking questions about Amos Whitlock, something in him went very still and very careful, in the way of a man who has spent 2 decades building a comfortable life on a foundation he does not want disturbed. He came to her himself, 3 days later, finding her at work scrubbing down the coach's exterior in the livery yard, and he was, at first, all warmth, complimenting her industry, expressing surprise that a girl alone had managed to purchase the old wreck at all, offering, with what looked like genuine generosity, to buy the coach back from her at triple what she'd paid, on account of, he said, sentimental interest in the town's old relics. Mercy, who had inherited more of her father's patience and her mother's sharp eye than Silas Pruitt had reckoned on, thanked him, and told him she'd think on it, and thought instead, watching him walk away, about how strange it was that a busy banker would trouble himself over a rotting coach, unless he had some particular reason to want it gone. She said nothing yet of what she'd found. She went instead to the one person in town she trusted absolutely, her old friend Eli Marsh, now grown into a steady young man, running his family's feed store, and showed him the ledger and the letter in the privacy of his back storeroom, and watched his face go through disbelief and then a kind of quiet, burning anger on Amos Whitlock's behalf, that told her she had chosen rightly in trusting him. The conflict, once it began in earnest, moved quickly. Silas Pruitt, sensing that his first approach had failed to secure the coach, changed tactics within the week, using his considerable influence with the town council to raise the old whispers again. Was it not strange, he suggested at the general store, at church, at the council meeting itself, that this outsider girl had suddenly taken such an interest in poor Amos Whitlock's coach, in the old widow's fund, in matters better left buried? Was it not possible she meant some manner of fraud, some scheme to profit off the town's old grief? He was careful, always, to phrase his suspicions as concern rather than accusation, and he found, to Mercy's dismay, that 20 years of a town's guilt and shame over its own harsh judgment of a dead man made fertile ground for exactly this kind of doubt. It was easier, for many in Larkspur Hollow, to suspect the orphan girl than to reckon honestly with what it would mean if Amos Whitlock had been innocent all along, and they had spent 2 decades speaking his name like a curse. Mercy found herself, within days, the subject of the very kind of talk that had once buried a dead man's reputation, watched with narrow eyes at the mercantile, whispered about on porches, her hard-won standing in the town, thin as it was, threatening to collapse before she had ever gotten the chance to prove anything at all. Deakins, frightened for his own reputation, told her gently that perhaps it would be best if she moved the coach along elsewhere. Even Eli's own father grew uneasy at his son's involvement. It would have been easy, in that week, for Mercy to fold, to sell the ledger's contents quietly, take what money she could, and vanish before Silas Pruitt's rising campaign against her turned into something worse. She thought of her mother instead, turning ruined things into something worth keeping, and she thought of her father, standing patient and still, at the edge of a frightened animal's corral, waiting to be trusted, and she decided that she had not come this far, lost this much, to let a comfortable man's fear of the truth bury it a second time. She called, with Eli's help and the reluctant cooperation of the town's aging pastor, a public gathering at the church on a Sunday evening, announced simply as, concerning the old Whitlock coach, and matters of interest, to every family who had lost someone in the Comstock mine collapse. Silas Pruitt, unable to refuse attendance without looking guilty of exactly the thing he feared, sat in the third pew with his composure carefully arranged, watching Mercy Callahan, 16 years old, in her one good dress, her hands steady, though her voice shook at first, stand at the front of a church full of people who had spent a week believing the worst of her, and lay out, piece by careful piece, what she had found. She read from the ledger, calling out names that made old women in the congregation gasp and reach for their neighbors' hands, their own grandmother's contributions, recorded in a dead man's careful hand 20 years before. She read Amos Whitlock's letter aloud in full, her own voice breaking only once, at the passage where he wrote of hoping to lead the danger away from the town he was sworn to serve. And the church went silent, in the particular way that silence falls over people confronting a wrong they had helped commit, without ever meaning to. And then, because she had done her own careful digging in the days prior, corresponding by wire with the county land office in Cheyenne, she laid out one final piece, the pattern, plain as day once assembled, of exactly which ranches Silas Pruitt's bank had acquired in the years following the mine disaster, and at what suspiciously reduced prices, from families whose fathers had died in that same collapse, and whose relief money they'd been told was stolen and gone forever, might otherwise have kept them solvent long enough not to sell. Silas Pruitt did not confess, that night or ever, to any wrongdoing beyond hard bargaining, and no court in Wyoming territory would have compelled him to. But he did not need to confess. The town's collective memory, once disturbed, could not be put back to sleep, and in the weeks that followed, as the recovered relief fund was formally counted and verified by the county, and the process of returning it to the surviving families and descendants, named in Amos Whitlock's ledger, began under the pastor's and the new mayor's joint oversight, the quiet, communal judgment of Larkspur Hollow turned, slowly and completely, away from Silas Pruitt. Customers found other places to bank when the territory chartered a second institution in town the following spring. Neighbors who had once deferred to him grew cool and correct. He kept his brick building and his fortune, technically untouched by any law, but he lost the one thing a man like Silas Pruitt had spent his whole life carefully building, the town's good regard, and he lost it, not by force, but by the simple, unhurried weight of truth, finally being permitted to stand where a lie had stood for 20 years. It was not the dramatic reckoning some might have wished for him, but it was, Mercy came to understand, its own kind of justice, the quiet kind, the kind that does not need a courtroom, only the truth finally allowed to breathe. Mercy herself took not 1 cent of the recovered fund for her own use, though the town, in its gratitude, tried more than once to press money on her, and though $7.40 would remain, for some months yet, very nearly all she had in the world. What she asked for instead, when the council offered her anything within their power to give, was simple: that Amos Whitlock's name be formally and publicly cleared in the town record, that a modest headstone be raised over his grave to replace the unmarked plot he had been given, and that his widow and son, whom Eli helped track down living 2 counties away, under a different name they'd taken to escape the shame of Whitlock, be found and told, at long last, the truth of what their husband and father had actually done in that blizzard 20 years before. All of this was done, and because the town could not simply let the girl who had restored their history to them walk away with nothing, they offered her, instead, work, steady, respectable work, first mending harness and coach leather for deacons at a fair wage, and later, as her reputation for patient, careful craftsmanship spread, work of her own choosing, in a little shop of her own, on the very street where she had once stood alone with a carpetbag and nowhere to go. 16 years old, and she had owned nothing in this world but a carpetbag, a dead mother's Bible, and $11.40, and with the last of it, she had bought a broken, cursed, forgotten thing that everyone else had decided was worthless, because somewhere deep down, she had never quite believed that anything truly finished being useful, just because other people said so. What waited beneath that driver's bench was never really about the silver, though the silver mattered, and it changed lives, and it put land back into hands that had nearly lost it forever. What waited there, in truth, was a dead man's good name, held in trust for 20 years, by a coach nobody wanted, in a town that had forgotten how to look closely at the things, and the people, it had already given up on. Mercy Callahan had looked closely. She had waited, the way her father taught her to wait, with frightened, wary things, and she had seen worth, the way her mother taught her to see it, in a chair nobody else could bear to sit in. And in doing so, this orphaned girl, with almost nothing, gave an entire town back something it thought it had lost forever. Not just money, but its capacity to admit it had been wrong, and to make that wrong right again. Thank you for spending this time with Mercy's story, and with us. If it moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who might need to hear it tonight. And if you have a moment, leave us a comment. We'd love to know, what is a time you found real value in something everyone else had already written off? We read every one. Until next time, stay close.